I think it's probably a good moment. We begin this wonderful program. Hello, and welcome to our last in a series of webinars in conjunction with the exhibit at the Sheldon Museum, Artists in the Archive, Community, History and Collage, that was curated by Rick Cassini-Kadur. My name is Eva Garcelon-Hart, and I'm the archivist at the Sheldon. In case you don't know where Vermont or Sheldon Museum and Millbury is, we are some little speckle on the map, somewhere between Montreal, halfway between Montreal and Boston. So last spring, Rick invited several artists from across the US and also several countries in Europe to look at our archives and our archival collections and interpret and offer their point of view, artistic eye, with an eye on community. And the whole project was conducted remotely. Me and my colleague Taylor Rossini shared about 100 images from our collections, and then followed up with one-on-one with some of the artists. So this sort of collaboration resulted in a folio of 24 collages, which right now form our exhibit at the Sheldon. Artists look at all kinds of elements which may form community, human, non-human, nature, animals, seasons, all kinds of other things, water, as well as human interaction during time of peace and war, and many other sort of aspects which you can see in their artistic outcome. The exhibit was supposed to close at the end of this year, of the beginning actually at January of 23, but we decided to extend it, and we'll reopen it on May 13, which happens to coincide with World Collage Day. So it's an additional incentive and sort of sign from heavens that that's a great opportunity to extend this exhibit throughout the summer. It will be enhanced with a couple of mini exhibits with focus on sort of forgotten and invisible communities. Vermont is known as a first or second or third whitest state in the country. Historically, even was more so. So we are just kind of shedding light on people of color, presence of Asians, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. So if you can, please come and visit. Today's program will engage artists from Europe. I'm so happy I'm not the only one who has an accent, so this is the first time probably happens. And two of the artists, unfortunately, will not be able to join us, Lilia Shavaga and especially Clara Esperson, who let me know that she deeply regrets that she couldn't be with us. However, I'm very happy to introduce Marta Janik. Hello, Marta. We are both Polish, so it's a wonderful occasion to say hello. Anthony Di Kelly from Ireland, Jack Rabi, an Italian artist who resides in Scotland, and Rick, who actually grew up where I happen to reside right now, but he's all over the place, and he will be master of ceremony today. So I'm so happy that we are all here in this space. So as you may know, during the exhibit monthly, we presented these webinars inviting artists focusing on different topics. We'll provide a link to our previous recordings. This program is recorded as well, so you can watch it at your leisure. And what else do I want to say? This is a free program, and we are happy to have you all here. But if you can and want to, please support us. We are a small place trying to provide this great programming, but obviously we appreciate any kind of support you can offer. And just to conclude, I would like to acknowledge that we broadcast this program from ancestral homeland of Abenaki and other native peoples, now known as Vermont. So Rick, please take over from me, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ava, and welcome everybody. I'm more and more enjoying these collage live events, and this partnership with the Sheldon Museum has been a really wonderful one because we've been able to do a series of programs with them. But today we're looking at the Artist in the Archive exhibition, and particularly the work of European artists who were working with an American archive. And I just want to give you some background and speak a little bit about that briefly before we hear from the artists. To make the exhibition, we invited an international network of collage artists to engage with the historical material in the archive. And the exhibition, the body of work, unfolded as a book, a folio of prints, and then this program series. And I'm going to put a link in chat in a little bit if you want to follow it and see more about what this project is about. We were invited to kind of work with the Sheldon in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Stewart-Swift Research Center, which is the archive of the Sheldon Museum, and a wonderful treasure of Vermont history and information. Each of the collage prints in the Artist in the Archive speaks to an idea about community, how the historical material in the archive shapes our sense of community. And the idea of community was interpreted both locally, as in Middlebury, Vermont, but also in terms of what the material in the archive says about communities across Vermont, across New England, and ultimately in a globalized 21st century world. A number of the artists who participated in the project did so from Europe. And I'm going to just share my screen. And move forward a little bit. This was really interesting for me in particular for a couple reasons. In my curatorial work, I think a lot about how Americans see themselves. I'm an American, I'm also a Canadian, and so I have a dual national perspective. And I'm generally interested in how communities and countries and places see themselves. But America in particular, for a couple of reasons. One is that in America, we often are unaware of how our cultural homogeneity kind of projects itself out into the world. And so you can go to many, many places in the world and see America's influence and presence. Most, notably, is you can go anywhere and find a McDonald's, right? And that means we have a broad view and tend to equate sometimes the world and the way the world thinks with us ourselves, and it is being kind of the same thing when it's actually much more complicated. And to further complicate that, only 37% of Americans have a passport. So only 37% of Americans are leaving the country and experiencing outside of the world. And that, I think, is somewhat unique, particularly when you think of North America and Europe in general. In Europe, there's a lot more exchange and travel and fluidity than we have in America. But I also believe that artists have a role to play here. I think artists can be really, really good at holding up a mirror to a society so that society can make sense and think of itself. And in particular, I'm thinking of the work of Anselm Kiefer, particularly this difficult work from his early period where he was painting people performing the Nazi salute as a way of engaging with his fellow Germans around how they remembered World War II at a time when a lot of people were preferring to forget. He was putting that mirror there. And in a similar way, this is Christopher Spencer, also known as Cold War Steve. He's a contemporary collage artist based in Scotland who makes satirical collages that lampoon aspects of British society and its leaders. And in doing that in a very fun way, kind of asks us to think about what's actually going on here and develop a perspective that might be out of our own thinking. In this work, artists offer their fellow citizens an opportunity for those citizens to see themselves. That's, I think, one of the gifts artists give, like people in their own community. But there's something different that happens when an artist is working from outside of a culture. And we see this at the collage artist residencies we host in Scotland, where we get to see how Americans are making sense and reflecting on a small rural village in Europe. This project at the Sheldon, the reverse happened. It was an opportunity to see how European artists were making sense of a small rural town in America. And just to double down on what Ava said, if you have an opportunity to visit Middlebury, Vermont, please do, because it is an absolutely beautiful and wonderful place. And it was an enormous amount of joy from my perspective to be able to bring all of these eyes onto that place. I was not born there. I didn't finish my youth there. I finished high school there. And so it's been a part of my history for a very long time. But there's differences from between Americans and Europeans are sometimes not even well understood. The Pew Research Center started studying this, and I'll put a link in the chat, because they identified back in 2016 5 different ways that Americans and Europeans are different. Like that we have a lot in common, and a lot of Americans trace their lineage back to Europe. But there's also a lot of differences that are not necessarily understood. So, for example, the Pew Research Center talks about how Americans are more likely to believe they control their own destiny. That's just a belief that Americans have. And Americans tend to prioritize individual liberty, while Europeans tend to value the role of the state to ensure that no one in society is in need. And just those two different things really shape a lot of the worldview in which Americans and Europeans are being in the world. Another example is there is greater tolerance in the US than in Europe for offensive speech. In fact, Kiefer's work was largely attacked and criticized when it originally debuted in Germany. And it took a lot of work on the part of Kiefer, as well as his mentor, who happened to be a survivor of the Holocaust, to say, no, this was important. This was important work that should be seen and put out in the world. That's not a conversation we would necessarily, or a difficulty an artist might face in the US, where up until recently, themes of censorship were largely frowned upon. Although, as we know, that's changing. And I would say the last thing I'd point out is that religion is significantly less important to Europeans than Americans. That's a very different, Europeans and Americans have a very different relationship to religion. And that's going to inform communities. It's going to inform how communities are shaped and structured, or even what is a community, meaning thinking through that. I live in the American South, and so church communities are very important to my neighbors. And it's not something I really thought much about until I kind of moved here and started really engaging with that. So with that in mind, I'm going to stop talking. And I think I'd like to hear from Jack, who's going to take over and share his screen. But welcome, Jack.
Thank you, Rick. I'm going to share screen. Yes. So my name is Jack Ravi, and I am an Italian artist. I live in Scotland, and I have lived in the UK for 10 years, around about 10 years. I'm a collage and mixed media artist, and a lot of my work actually uses found photographs. So that wasn't a big stretch for me. I do a lot of work with vintage photographs that I source, flea markets, charity shops, online, and so on. I've written a book about using photos to make art. So it's something that is in my nature, and I find that very comfortable. But the twist here was to work with an archive. So the way that I approach my collage is quite sort of physical, tactile, and I like to look at how they feel in my hands, the textures, and also very much visually. But the challenge here was having to interact with a digital image and an archive. But I accepted the challenge, also thinking that the archive would have a very similar sort of challenge, the opposite challenge, I would imagine, that they're not used to looking for I don't know, textures. They wouldn't be able to source in an archive something based on the amount of staining on the paper had, which is what attracts me. So we were both sort of working sort of out of our comfort zone in a bit. And so I accepted the challenge. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And the way that I decided to approach this was to, not knowing anything really about Vermont history, I thought about thinking about more universal themes and something that I could relate to. And so the theme that I decided to explore while thinking about community and people together was the theme of the storytelling, oral traditions, and just sort of finding my way into this project, thinking about like themes that are more like archetypical themes and the collective unconscious, which is something that I explore a lot in my work. And so I looked through the archives, and this is one of the photos that I found, and it's called Listen Up Kids. There's not very much context, but there is an adult figure talking to kids in the woods, and I thought this was a really good starting point for me, thinking about a place where a story could have been told. And then I moved towards the idea of stories around the campfire as a physical and also metaphorical sort of experience of gathering and listening to stories and then telling them, and then the stories being passed down from generation to generation. And from that, I thought about like more social and collective gatherings of people. So there was this beautiful photo of a maypole dance, and I knew that there would be county fairgrounds images in the collection, and I thought that would be another great idea to incorporate this images and social functions as well. And from that, I thought schools, what better place than to tell stories. And there is a huge amount of beautiful photographs of classrooms and kids outside their schools, and I have used a lot of them. I'm only showing 4 here. And then I also thought about sports as a place where you meet with like-minded people, and you maybe play a game, and then you sort of unpack and go for a drink and talk about your stories, and whatever happens in the match is then. So I then started to move more towards the idea of sort of gatherings of places where there would be a sense of belonging, and sports was one, and also music. So I had this lovely photographs of student bands and Middlebury bands, and just a place where again people would gather with a common purpose. And this is a firefighter's funeral procession, and I thought that also is like the workplace as another opportunity for stories to be told. And then I also opened this up to more private settings of like family gatherings, and there's a group of boaters and men and women in a lake, sort of thinking about the more intimate sort of scenarios where stories are told. And so I couldn't really choose, and I decided that all of these images will be somehow incorporated in this piece. There's 88 squares in this collage, and I used this photo. I used more than the photos I've shown, and I cropped them to a square size and included a whole different range of people and settings, with the idea that these were all opportunities for stories to be told. And I was also working with, I also then found this image of a tree, and I really needed a focal point for my collage. And so I thought the tree would be a really beautiful element to incorporate for a couple of reasons. One, the tree itself being a symbol of knowledge, and I thought ideal symbol for a collage about stories, but also thinking about like what all of these people have in common, and just pushing the idea of a tree as a family tree, like a sort of like ancestors, sort of inclusive family tree, like a genealogy kind of image that would be put in the middle. This is not exactly the tree. It's a graphic that I used inspired by this photograph. And then I was when I was working on the collage, I was there was a back and forth with Eva and Taylor, and they gave me some images. They provided the Drive folder with images. And I think Taylor also had the idea of suggesting using, looking into the audio visual archive. And so I came across this really interesting interview with Jessica Swift. And I was just listening to this as I was working. And what was really interesting was that I found this piece that I'm going to read, where she talks about her father coming down the stairs when he was at home to basically tell stories. And he would do that in front of the fireplace. So the idea of stories around the campfire was just spot on here. And so I'm going to read what she says. If he was at home, he always took the Bible down at 9 o'clock and read from the Bible. And he read from the Greek and would be lying on the floor in front of the fireplace in mother's room. And father would read to us. Then he'd close the book on his finger, and then he would tell us about the ancient world, Samaria and Babylon and Persia and Egypt and Alexandria. Father had a perfectly beautiful voice. He had a ring like a bell, an overtone, and very sweet and very musical, and a beautiful singing voice. That boy has the voice of an angel, people used to say. And so I then decided that I was going to incorporate this bit of interview at the top of my collage. And I sort of faded it so that you can't necessarily read every single word. And I'm okay with that. I didn't need sort of the audience to be able to read every single word. It's a visual, it's got some text, but the idea, again, also that I shaded all of these images. So the idea is that stories being told even centuries ago and then passed down from generation to generation, and what we get is a fragment of the original story. And so by sort of fading the text, I want to incorporate the idea of a story being passed down and changed and somehow modified or corrupted or sort of altered. And so this is my final piece, and it's called A Million Stories. And I like to think that this collage shows a million people, a million voices telling a million stories. So this is me, and this is my work. Thank you.
Nice.
Well, thank you, Jack. Next, we will hear from Marta, who is also obsessed with trees.
Yes, I just love trees, so I was very happy to be in relationship with the tree, and because I think, and what I try to show in my works is this that people are not the most important ones, and we live in relationships with animals, with trees, and it was a real pleasure to do this collage and to take part in this project. And I wanted to start from the definition of collage artist and collage art. When people ask me, what does it mean to be a collage artist, or what is it actually to create collage, I always like to answer that it's like archaeology of memory. And this is what I think, this is what I like, and this is what I cherish. And I think that we collage artists are like those archaeologists, like we dig in archives. This is what I do very often. And I like to think that I give the second life to the images which are maybe forgotten or lost. I don't know, I like to find new pieces, people who are already died many centuries ago even, and then finally they get a new life. So it was a real pleasure to do this collage, and I was searching for trees and for people gathering under the trees or having relationship to trees. And yes, so when you, my collage is basically a tree, like a family tree. And we are talking about differences a lot, but for me, being part of this project means also to be a part of community, like a community of collage artists, but of people also. And I have had no idea about Vermont. Like it was like I knew that there is a state in the USA, but I had no idea that elm trees were crucial for the state, that the Vermont's villages were lined with giant elm trees. And I had no ideas that almost all elm trees disappeared in the 20th century. And it made me think. And for me, it was also opportunity to read more about history. So this is what I like in my job, actually, as an artist, not only illustration, but also getting deeper into topics. So I read about Dutch elm disease and a beetle who is spreading the fungus, and the beetle was responsible for the death of the trees. But the poor beetle, I'm saying poor because actually when I read more, I realized that it's us human who are responsible for spreading this disease because of the wood export, because, yeah, so it shows a lot. So you can see the beetle at the bottom of my work, and you can see all kinds of illustrations showing people having fun, being happy, with animals also. Right now, the girl with the dog lying under the tree. You can see two happy girls. I especially like those girls in the middle of the collage. They are very happy and they jumped on the tree having fun. Fancy dresses are important and they are just happy to be alive. And on the left top corner, this is an illustration. This is the first photo I found in the archives, actually, the guy walking. And I read also that Vermont, the name comes from green. And the guy is just walking through Vermont and he's admiring the views. So this is what I think when I look at the guy. And then there was a day when I found two little girls and I gave them the seed of a elm tree. And I was thinking that it would be nice if they planted the new tree, which can be the beginning of something new, the new life. So yes, this is my work. And in using this occasion that I can share my my work with you, I wanted to tell a few words about the collage I did for a bear in Ireland. And it also shows a giant tree. It's an oak tree. I was very happy to take part in the project curated by Rick also. Empty columns are a place to dream, and collage artists were asked to propose something instead of an empty column which stands in the city center of Birr. And I said, because there were times where Duke Cumberland, the English guy, was placed on the top of the column in the middle of the town because he won over Scots, and British people put him in Ireland on the top to show Irish people that, be careful, we won over Scots. And I was thinking that what would happen if Irish people or British people or all together, they planted the tree? We would have the giant, wonderful oak tree. And I think for me, it would be the best monument ever. Personally, I have problems with monuments. I don't, there are only few maybe monuments I found really interesting and wonderful. But the tree, for me, it would be the best monument ever. And we have this, I don't know if you do this in the United States, but in Poland, every time when we have very old tree or older tree, we put the board on the tree that it's the monument of nature. So for me, this tree is a monument of nature, monument of history, and I used the birds, the flowers, and of course the parts of Irish lives and nature. And I did this collages just to resign for a moment from anthropocentric perspective. Just put the tree maybe in the center and just to pay attention that we are not alone and we are responsible also for trees. And what I found out was that in the previous times, back then, years ago, before cutting the tree, people actually prayed to the spirits. And there were special prayers, I don't know, for maple tree, oak tree, ash tree, elm tree. And nowadays we're cutting so many trees. I'm not saying about praying before cutting, but just without thinking. This is happening in Poland right now. We have problem. We have just this amazing primeval forest on the east of the country, and the government and politicians make all the time the decisions to cut more trees and more trees. And yes, so I'm sensitive to the topics like deforestation, afforestation, trees, nature, people, community, and what can we do to be happy and to live together simply. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Next, we'll hear from Anthony Kelly.
Hello, Rick. Hello, everybody. Hi, Jack. Thank you. Thank you, Martha and Jack, for sharing your perspectives on your work. I'm just going to share my screen, if that's okay. And I want to speak a little bit about the work that I've made for the Artists in the Archives project. Also, I took part in the Empty Columns Are a Place to Dream, so I'll share a little piece of that work. And finally, I'll share a little piece about the migration project that Martha actually curated between Birr and Warsaw last year, because I think it speaks to changing perspectives, movements of communities, and what we bring forward and what we leave behind. So one moment. So when I was looking through the archives for the Henry Sheldon Museum, the Stewart-Swift Research Centre, what I was looking for really were acts of creativity and how creative and craft making contributes to and equates with acts of community care. So this is my first image. I've made two for this project, and this is close knit. And in this, I'm just really exploring these ideas of textiles and agriculture and craft making. And I was interested actually in American quilt making as a form of historical documentation, but also that in these communities which were just forming across these territories, that the trade in textiles and the trade in these goods would provide pathways for communication, for conversation, for integration, and allow communities to become more tight-knit and close-knit and allow other relationships to form. I was also interested in that idea of skill sharing and knitting circles and weaving and actual craft-based ways of sitting around, getting people together, teaching one another, but then having those other greater conversations, and actually even the creation of goods and the sharing of those goods with loved ones and family members as acts of community care, literally creating things that you can offer to somebody to keep them warm. So this was my first piece. And I also came across this interesting postcard by C.F. Rich, and it was a postcard of Middlebury and Main Street. And actually in the original image, the postcard had sort of superimposed airships and a subway station somewhere around here, and all of these kind of futuristic ideas and projections about what Middlebury would look like in the future. And I thought that that was a really interesting thing, because I'm interested in how we speculate and how we use the creative process to run out somehow ahead of society and think, what would we like? How do we dream this kind of future? And then how do we enact that? So this is Anthem for the Future. And with this, I'm just really speaking to, I'm kind of updating the original postcard, and then I am thinking about what would we like, the music, the air is filled with color and music here, and it's kind of a spaceport, and there's all of this kind of thing happening, right? And just the optimism of dreaming and how creativity can help us visualize something that could be good, or something that could be more hopeful, and something that we can reach for in the future. And that does relate then very directly to, this is the work that I created for the Empty Columns Are a Place to Dream project in Birr. And you can see quite clearly here that there's an empty space at the top of the column, and Rick had actually asked us to think about what would we like to place there. What would be something that would be valuable to carry forward, or what would we like to pass down through generations? Not this great man, or actually the conqueror who was positioned initially at the top of this column. And I really thought again about the idea of dreaming together and the power of that, and how if we share our dreams and our creativity in that kind of community-based way, we can speculate, we can inform each other. And the dreaming is also this sort of universal experience that we all have, and it accesses really deep parts of us, right? So we all dream, and we all have something to offer from our dreams. And also I was struck by Birr as well, as this small town in the centre of Ireland, but which also has, it's the site of the invention of the steam turbine, and the first steam motor car was invented there. And it was once home to the world's largest telescope, the Leviathan of Birr, which is still on site at the castle grounds. And I suppose something that runs through a lot of my work is this idea of looking back at the world as it exists, but with a kind of renewed sense of magic and wonder. And just the idea of the Leviathan of Birr, and it's this machine that is being created there, and it just sits there, but it's actually this machine for looking at the heavens and looking beyond our own world, and how that can fade into the background if we don't pay attention to it. But somebody had actually dreamt of that and created it and pulled together the resources to make that a reality. And just on that theme then of what we bring forward or what we leave behind, this is Empty Nests, and it is a piece of work that I created for the Migration Project in Warsaw and Birr last year. And with this piece of work, I was just interested in, we hear a lot about, and rightly so, about the countries of arrival, but also in Ireland, we have this real sort of experience of being a country of departure. And I sourced images here. This is the abandoned village on Achill Island, just off the west coast of Ireland, Mayo, where I live. And it is one site of many around the county where the population was once so vast, but had actually left in such droves for many different countries, many different places, that this landscape is completely depopulated now. And some sites, places that were actually in, there was accounts of them being rich with music and laughter. You can only tell that people had lived there by the sight of potato runnels, and they're quite high up on the hillsides, because so many people lived there at one point that they had to actually cultivate the land at more and more awkward altitudes to have space. But now when you move through that landscape, there is maybe one house every kilometer and a half. So it's quite a haunted place. And I was really thinking then about the American experience of, the pace of change and development as it occurred there and as people arrived, and the pace of change and absence actually in Ireland as a country of departure, and what that means. So these are the works. This is me. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you, Anthony. If you have a question for the panelists or would like to explore a topic, please feel free to put a comment in the chat or to use the Q&A function. I'm curious with the folks, was there anything that really struck out as very different or that you learned about America by experiencing the archives that surprised you? No? Yeah. Taylor, are you going to join us?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Taylor. I worked with Eva on coordinating this project on the Sheldon Archives end. And as we wait for some questions to come in from the audience, I will ask you a question of my own. So as I was watching all of the artists work on this project, I was kind of intrigued by the color palette that our archive and archives in general offer to a collage artist, and seeing all of the work collectively from this exhibit. Certain artists kind of embraced this, you know, the past is black and white, it's very sepia toned, it's kind of weathered and worn. And some artists really were able to integrate color both from our archive, but from other materials as well that kind of chafe against this vision of the past being this very dull, drab place. And so I'm curious if any of you have any kind of reflections on how you use color in this project, or how you approach kind of pulling from this palette that archival materials offer you.
I can say a few words. So as you see, all of the photographs I use in my collage are black and white. And I chose them because they correspond with the green tree. So I wanted to have this contrast in my illustration, like the past and maybe the present, but also the seed the girls are having in their hands. It's also colorful. So this is like life, simply. So yeah, this is what I was focusing at.
I maybe want to answer Rick and Taylor if I can. So when you ask if I noticed differences, I don't think I did. But there is something about going into a project like this, not knowing, also working out of your comfort zone and not knowing what you're dealing with and the history, and that can be daunting. And I did find myself a little unsettled initially, thinking that I didn't know what I was working with. But I think for me, looking at what I thought I could find in an archive, if that makes sense, thinking about what could I probably find, it just made it much easier for me to tackle it and just think about how do I approach an archive that's in an American state, just the same as I would if that archive was anywhere else. And that's kind of why I decided to go with a theme that was just so broad and quite universal. So yeah, I don't think I learned anything in that sense, but I found a sort of like a common sense of belonging and a shared history, though we have completely different histories. But this idea of like sort of collective unconscious and a history that comes from way before our physical ancestors. So that's one thing. And I also wanted to say to Taylor that I personally really enjoy muted and neutral colors. So I like that's very much my palette. I don't tend to add very bright colors, but there's a space for that for me too, and I have done work that was a lot more colorful, but the papers that I source are usually old, and that's why I'm drawn to them, that sort of faded and stained, and so the lack of color for me is comfortable. But yeah, so that's my answer.
All right. Jack or Anthony, I'm sorry, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, please. Yeah, I was just interested in maybe answering that question that Rick posed first. I think there's a kind of a gap in knowledge from my side as well of the history that I'm speaking to, right? And I think that it's not just exclusively an American thing to think that to maybe project similarities into that gap, right? And I think that actually from Europe, we might do that too. And I think as well in Ireland, particularly, we have this sort of idea of this diaspora and that kind of relationship with America, right? And we might even think that American is exclusively Irish here sometimes, right? You know, so we can kind of put that on it, right? And I think that that was interesting. And there's a piece in the book that you've written about, because that you had a piece, I can't remember the exact heading, it was something about falsehoods or things aren't always what they seem. And actually that postcard that I used in that particular work, Anthem for the Future, that was something that was carried out, postcards for different towns, and the same image was used and the same idea was projected. So that was something that I was missing in my own investigation, because I had a gap in my own sort of knowledge, right? But there was more to it, and something was more kind of commercial about that than I had realized, because I was filling in the gaps. And to Taylor as well, I just like to say, because I know that my color palette is actually quite vibrant, and I do enjoy the challenge of just integrating images, right? It's something that I really love in collage, and I suppose I'm always using the language of weaving, right? You know, and I just really like the idea of how do I take this and make the image work, even though I'm using something that's very vibrant. How do I make it look like it's a unified image, right? And as well, I think in a lot of my work as well, I'm trying to impart that sense of hope and the future, right? And also, like, I mean, the past was in full Technicolor, right? I mean, just maybe imagine, because of black and white photographs, that it was black and white somehow, or more sepia tone, but like a lot more vibrant than that. Well, thank you.
I'd like
If I
to share
may.
oh, sorry, Marta, do you want to go ahead?
No, sorry, because I wanted to answer your question, maybe try to answer your question about differences and how I found myself different. I found myself very similar to the people I found on photographs. Like, yeah, maybe it's obvious, but I was thinking like, wow, people were like we are now years ago. Like we are looking at the shadows under the tree. We are kissing boys or girls under the trees. We are taking photos with trees because we just simply think that they are beautiful. We admire trees, and trees are simply there, like witnesses of our history. So this is what I was thinking, that we are at the end the same, like, and we need the same, like we need shadows, for example, all of us. So yeah.
I wanted to share the postcard that Anthony was originally working with. And because one of the things I love about this project is how it ends up, for me, identifying these other and different paths of research. And so I got really curious about this particular source material that Anthony was using, and ended up doing a little bit of research around it, and ended up finding, because also it's a collage, like it is absolutely a very early collage. What I found was that the person who made it was going around to different towns and essentially selling the same idea to different towns. And so this is the one from Middlebury, Vermont, and this is one from Milton, Vermont. You see the same blimp and cars in there. And then he got over to, this is Bennington, Vermont. He got down to Bennington, Vermont and did one. And then ultimately over to Montpelier and I think Wilmington. to be using a lot of the elements in the different collages in the town. And he's inspired by this particular series of artworks, postcards that came out of the turn of the century international fair in France. But that's, for me, is what's so fun about working with artists who are working in the archives, is the artists identify things, and then there's just so much to explore and learn as you're moving through that.
All right, thank you all. So a question from an audience member from Canada, and this is perhaps more of a topic that I'll put out to all of you and you can respond as you feel comfortable. But Rita is thinking about the inclusion or lack of inclusion of Indigenous history and place and ways of knowing. I'm presuming she's thinking within the Sheldon archive, of course, being the materials that were available to you. And so I will say that our archive, like all archives, is reflective of a certain collecting interest and a certain collecting mission. And it is certainly reflective of materials and a history that are, you know, Euro-American. It's a settler colonial history. It's largely focused on a time after, you know, the quote unquote end of Indigenous society in the 19th century view that Henry Sheldon whose collecting was informed by. And so I guess in trying to pose this as a question to you all, was the American relationship with Indigenous history something that you were thinking about as you were using perhaps materials related to landscape or related to place? Or was that not necessarily something that was, I don't want to say not of interest to you, you know, but not something that was coming to the sort of fore of your thinking as you engaged with these materials?
I just wanted to briefly answer this, that I maybe not specifically thinking about natives, but I did notice the lack of representation in the collection, which is obviously a very common. It's part of the background of history that we need to unpack. But that I noticed, and I did not want my collage representing 1 million people and 1 million voices to be purely white. And so I did cheat in the sense that I did use images of non-white people from the collection that I put purely because I needed to have representation in my work. Everyone else was selected because it was an image that represented storytelling, and I was quite specific about that. But I did incorporate images of Black folk that would have not necessarily, they were just portraits that I just needed to incorporate. So that's not specifically Native Americans, which I don't think I found in the collection at all, but the few non-white, like Black and possibly Asian, an older elderly woman, I think I incorporated just because I needed to break up the whiteness of my work. But yeah, thank you.
And I want to say that in the project itself, a number of artists tackled that specific challenge that every archive has, which is there are absences in the archive. And a number of the artists focused on different identities, be it African-American or Jewish or Asian, and trying to find kind of hold space for those voices, because there was a recognition that those people were part of the community. They are part of the community today, and it's how then they get represented. And one of the things I think artists have this magical ability to approach an archive, see the absence, and then make something that holds space for people regarding that absence. And specifically related to Native American issues, Todd Bartel's piece really took on the work of Manifest Destiny. And I believe he spoke about that at a program we had back in January, which is recorded, and you can go visit that off the Sheldon Museum website, I believe.
I just wanted to follow up with a couple of comments. First of all, we are considered the oldest community museum, and it always bothered me since I was on the staff of this institution. Why is it so? And the fact is, there is a reason. Henry Sheldon truly collected for community. So we are very sort of unusual in this sense that it wasn't a collector who collected for his own edification. It was collected because he wanted to pass it to community. However, community, of course, it was how community he has seen from his own perspective. And I have also a second comment. When I look at Rick's link to Pew Research Institute and all this research regarding differences between Europeans and Americans, I just think about it all the time. And actually this particular survey really pinpointed really pretty clearly what I always felt, but didn't necessarily do any specific research. I grew up in Poland, but I spent most of my life here in this country, in the United States. And I especially like, this first point about Americans believe that they are masters of their destiny, which I always found really difficult because me and Marta, we come from the region, sometimes referred to God's playground, where wars were devastating, taking away everything what people save. And there was never this certainty about I have it in a bank and therefore everything is great. I still, after many, many decades, I can't believe in this absolute security of and that I really am in charge of my destiny. On the other hand, when I look at records in our archives, you see fires, you see people coming and going, businesses were just extremely ephemeral. So where this idea came that we are really masters of our destiny, no matter how hard you work, people work here really hard. It's just incredibly difficult landscape and people really work hard without any guarantee. So where this probably Rick may have some idea, maybe Taylor or comment, where this idea that we are masters of, and we have some really true ability to basically guarantee where we are going. So thank you.
Yeah, that idea is built in the folklore of America from the beginning. I mean, they're from early sermons, and this idea of what America was sold to, particularly to Europeans, was you can come and you can have land, you can have space, you can have opportunity, and all of these things, and they inform the narrative of who we are in America, and so that destiny and the sense of ownership and land ownership, in particular, is something that is understood here in the States very differently than it is understood in Europe. And it very much intersects, though, with Indigenous issues, because how some Americans, how white Americans understand land ownership and its role and connection to freedom and independence is directly at odds to how a number of Indigenous peoples think about land ownership, and then how they think about it, how that also defines what freedom is. The freedom to kind of be on the land, to roam the land, to share the land with others. It's a very different model, but I think that's part of the psychic construction of America, because it's drilled into us, I think, at such a young age, that even after moving to Canada, I was really surprised how much I had those thoughts and beliefs, about independence and destiny and those sorts of very American ways of thinking. And I've tried to hold on to the better ones, and I've tried to put the not so great ones down, and it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll also say that I think the 19th century as a kind of unit of time plays this incredible role in creating this sort of founding mythology of the United States. And that is exactly the period in which Henry Sheldon was collecting. And so the materials that we have, you know, from, even though he's based out of this small town and he's focused purportedly on community history, there's a real thread that goes through both the object collection and the archive at the Sheldon Museum that is kind of piece by piece constructing this American chronology and this kind of exceptional founding American chronology. So Henry, like many 19th century collectors, was very interested in relic collecting, you know, taking bits and pieces from important historical objects or from important historical events, you know, and building this narrative piece by piece and ensuring that it was, you know, a little piece of wooden seat was exceptionally well labeled so that a visitor could understand exactly how this fit into this larger sort of mosaic of American history. So that being said, I will return to some questions from the audience. So we have a more technical brief question. Are all of these works digital collages, and which artists work in analog as opposed to digitally constructed images, or do you combine the two in your work?
Yeah, and I'll say that the project itself was structured as a digital project, in part because we were working with material from an archive. And so Eva and Taylor did not want us cutting up things in the archive, which means we were having to reproduce them. But the artists in the project, some have a digital practice, some we asked to work digitally, some chose to work in an analog fashion and then create a digital image of that. But with that, I'd actually love to hear from each of the artists about that tension between digital analog source materials that are precious and need to be preserved. Yeah.
I can answer. Personally, my work is 99.9% analog, but because of the nature of this project, it just seemed much easier and yeah, just more natural to work digitally. It's something that I've only started doing a year ago for the first time, and then didn't do it for another year. But I was working with digital images. I was interacting with Taylor and Eva digitally, and ultimately my piece was going to be printed for the exhibition in a specific size. So it just seemed more natural to use to work digitally. But I much prefer, if I can choose, working with pieces of paper and ripping and cutting. That's the way that I usually work, though I thoroughly enjoyed for this project working differently.
For me as well. I mean, I do most of the time, I do analog collages, but this time doing analog collage would mean that I have to print out the material I found in the archive, and it wouldn't make sense. And I would use tons of papers maybe. And it was simply easier to do the digital collage, like easier in the sense that the photos were already there and I just arranged them in a certain way I wanted.
I just wanted to say that in the exhibit, upcoming little enhanced exhibit, the three collages, digital collages, will be replaced with analog collages, Todd Bartels, Gina Pence, and Yang Shins, and these are specifically focusing on the indigenous populations and people of color and Asians. So I was lucky that it happened to be that these three artists work originally in analog. So it's very fortunate. So thanks.
I was just going to speak a little bit about my practice because I started originally in analog collage, but I moved to digital over time, sometimes for kind of lack of space to store materials at various points in my life, but also as I was creating analog work, I noticed that I was often working in a small format, and then I was wondering how to resize images and thinking about issues of permanence sometimes with coloring of paper. And I know some people embrace that, but I was started to work primarily to create prints actually, so digital seemed more natural. But I think there is a tension between the two, and I think actually while they're both labeled collage, they are both quite different mediums because they have a completely different set of restrictions and a completely different set of limitations. And actually analog collage, because you have to source your images from something directly within your environment, creates this other type of pressure to improvise, which is very different to digital collage, in which you can source whatever you want almost from wherever you want, right? So it's a different kind of creativity. You can just flow with everything and get everything that you need with digital collage, but analog is more improvisational. And I do also hear you, Jack and Martha, about kind of tearing and the physicality of it. And actually, I've been attracted back to analog collage more so recently, and I've started to draw actually with construction paper and this kind of thing in my practice. And I also wanted to just speak for a moment. While I did not speak directly to the Indigenous community in the United States, I felt actually maybe that I would feel that a little intimidated by that subject because I don't know if it's my history to own or to speak to, right? But also whenever I think about the famine actually, and in that final piece, there is this piece of Irish history in which the Choctaw Nation actually provided us with large amounts of famine relief as an indigenous community which had been colonized and were undergoing famine. So that is something that's really appreciated in Ireland. Now we do think about the Choctaw Nation, and there's scholarships for people from the Choctaw Nation carried out about by the University College in Cork. So there is a respect there. Yeah, so well, it's not maybe evident in the work. It's not something that I don't think about. Okay, thank you.
So as we're talking about analog versus digital and kind of the materiality of the work that you all do, another question from Diana asks why you are all attracted to paper collages in particular, as opposed to more mixed media or perhaps three-dimensional pieces that use a similar sort of pastiche technique.
Like I said, I do work predominantly analog, and I call myself a mixed media artist. So I do like incorporating more texture if I can than just paper. But again, working digitally, there were some limitations with that. And again, this was going to be printed, and so I couldn't really incorporate any three-dimensional object. But otherwise I do incorporate found objects or fabric a lot in generally in my pieces. So that's that.
I think that why collage artists love paper is a mystery best left for an epic research project by some future PhD student. Yeah.
All right, well, let's see. I will just say to Amanda, I see your question and I'm not ignoring it, but I think we've kind of circled around similar themes. So just in the interest of time, I'm gonna let that go. So I apologize. But a question from Charles, how would a postcard mail art add-on collage melt the difference between Poland, England, or any country wanting to be informed by a community archive? How might, quote, the address be the art? So thinking about one piece that's kind of moving throughout through time and space. Is that something that's exciting? Interesting to any of you? Is it something that any of you have maybe participated in?
I speak a little bit to that. I haven't taken part in it, but it would definitely be an interesting way of working, and I think it's actually hand in hand with the nature of collage anyway, right? Because it's where do we come in to that cycle? I mean, a lot of the pieces that I'm using, whether it's working with an archive or something I pick up out of contemporary printed material, is already taking influence from somewhere else, right? And then reincorporating that into something new. It could be interesting specifically to use things from my culture and then send it intentionally to somebody in a different country and see how they add on, and see if a circle comes full circle, what it looks like at the end. Like an exquisite corpse kind of project could be quite interesting. But I think that's just inherent in that kind of fragmentation and reintegration of materials in collage.
I also think that the international collage community just really excels at breaking down borders, particularly through like cross-cultural projects. I'll put a plug in for World Collage Day, second Saturday of May. That's one where we ask people to organize things in their own communities about collage. But what often happens is this fantastic exchange taking place where one community is hosting artists from another country or another place. For many years, there was a project, and I'll put a link to an article in Collage Magazine about it, called the Flying Glue Project, where artists were sending essentially passport-sized books, and they'd send them to each other until the book was done, and it would be a record of creativity that was also threading this community. So, and mail art is an absolutely incredible way of just exchanging visual ideas and information with other folks. And there's some tons of mail art resources online to get started with that, because you can kind of start developing those relationships within those networks. And collage plays a major role in mail art. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you. I think I will hand it back over to Eva to close us out, but thank you all for your thoughtful responses during this panel.
Yes, thank you so much to all of you, to Rick, to Marta, to Jack, and to Anthony, and to everybody, to audience, and to all the artists. We really, really appreciate, and reach out to us at any time, look at our recordings, and I can't thank all of you enough for looking at these crafty sort of pieces of paper and creating such wonderful, adventure and commentary, and bringing so much depth to forgotten pieces of paper that often few people look at. So thank you very much.
Eva and Taylor, thank you for having us. It's really been a wonderful project, and we appreciate how much work you did as the archivist to make it possible for us as artists to do our work. It takes a village.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And now Vermont is on my list. I need to visit.
Absolutely. We are here, and come at any time. I really would love to meet you in person. With Marta, we tried to do it on few occasions, but it didn't work out so far. So there is a future.
There is a future. Yes.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.